Thank you for viewing this presentation entitled the 2013 ROR Plan Challenge in collaboration with AAMD. The purpose of this presentation is to present all of the exciting results from the 2013 ROR Plan Challenge. Really, our objective is to offer you a ton of value. This project gives us an opportunity to see what treatment planners are doing really all over the world. And we want to show you some of those unique things that we did this year. Also present the philosophy behind the plan challenge and the metrics that we used. A little bit less of a focus than in times past, and really more of a focus on some of the sample plans that were submitted in an anonymous way, of course, and to provide some planning tips and tricks. We get requests all the time from the data that we bring in to share a little bit more, and so that was one of our goals with building the presentation this year, and we hope that you find that useful. At the forefront, we want to say a big thank you to the AAMD. This is our 5th year in collaboration with them, and we know that they truly believe in the value of this program. They've been a true partner in every sense of the word as we've gone through all of the iterations with the Plan Challenge, and we really hope to continue this for another 5 years and beyond. Now, our mission at ROR is really to be a positive disruptor, to be a solution provider, and we really feel like that's one of the things that the Plan Challenge does. And really the theme of this year and the outline of the presentation is to innovate, to inform, and ultimately to inspire through some of the information that we provide. It was interesting because we just participated in a recent AAMD regional meeting, and as we were given a presentation and talking to some of our colleagues, one of the feedback that we received was, in years past, we used to do a lot better job of providing tips and tricks, sharing more. And so with the mantra of less preaching and more teaching, that's really our goal with this year, and to provide the information in a useful way that you can provide in a practical way in the clinic. And then if you Google this phrase here, et al., you're going to find that it means and others or with others. And the point of this slide really is just to put out the fact that the Plan Challenge would not be possible with all of you, all the treatment planners that participate, all of those that give us positive feedback and even negative criticism, because what we have tried to do is really lead with our ears. And what I mean by that is to listen. And through a lot of the feedback, the project has, what we feel like, has continued to improve over the years. And we're already talking about things that we could do better for next year. We really want to call this Plan Challenge what it really is. It's research. We've been able to accumulate a lot of great data and useful information, and there's been publications that have come from this. And we anticipate a lot more in future projects. And really, specifically, this et al. Phrase at ROR has become almost a funny phrase. We've had some publications out there, and a lot of times I may do a bad job of thanking all of the ROR colleagues for all of their hard work. So I just want to say that up front during this presentation, is these Plan challenges typically take in order of 5 to 6 months of preparation. It's hundreds of volunteer hours beyond what we're doing with our clinical responsibilities. A lot of nights and weekends are involved, and I'm really blessed to be surrounded by world-class clinicians, dosimetrists, our support staff, our IT help, and really a lot of people to help make this project a success. So the scope of the project, the ROR Plan Challenge has grown in recent years, as you can see, since 2009. Every year it's grown in magnitude and outreach. The numbers continue to scale up. This past year we had over 350 plans submitted. This bar graph here on the far right is a little deceiving. We had a goal of 200 plan submissions. We fell a little short of that, but not far off. We actually, for the publication this year, will have 157 data points, but we've continued to receive some plans being submitted, so we're kind of creeping up closer to that 200 mark. But a lot of great participation this year. And as you can see from this picture, this represents all of the people that registered for this year's Plan Challenge. We had People register from the United States, from Australia, Europe. A lot more interest this year in places like Spain and India. So it's really exciting to see this level of participation. And with this, the next picture, this illustrates the plans that were actually submitted back to us. So the one prior was those that registered, and these were the actual plans that were submitted. We try to improve every year on making it easier to participate in terms of getting past the technical limitations with the website, marketing through various channels, just to get the word out. But we're definitely inspired from what we see not only in our part of the world but globally, and it's been a learning experience every year, and we try to share all of those great things with everyone that attends these presentations and maybe reads the publications. So real quick, if you're not familiar with the plan challenge, the mechanics of it and how it sort of operates is we pick a data set, we try to outline very clinically relevant treatment goals and a prescription, and I'll talk about this idea of a PQM. Essentially, it's just a combination of clinical goals that are scored, and we post those on our website. Once we open the project live, you basically dial into our website. You access all the necessary information. You fill out some pre-registration questions, which I'll talk about briefly later on. And once you have downloaded it to your treatment planning system of your choice, you can do the best possible work that you can do based on the clinical goals that were outlined. And for some reason, as part of this process, we have Kyle here kind of telling someone how good he is. But once you get done with your plan, you just submit back to us the plan and dose file. And our software that we use to analyze the treatment plans that come in is DICOM compatible, so it doesn't matter what treatment planning system you're using. We can even analyze and look at proton plans. So once the files are back within ROR, we use, like I said, this software, and it's called Quality Reports EMR. We use it on a clinical basis, but we use it as a foundation for our training program and for the plan challenge research. It allows us to quantitatively score the plans very quickly and easily and analyze a great deal of information very quickly. Hopefully you don't have a lot of delay in this video. What this video is showing is, first off, it's a three-dimensional rendering of the contours that were involved in this year's project. This is a 2PTV anal case. A very challenging case. We thought when we were first designing it, it wasn't going to be that much of a challenge, but a lot of the metrics we used forced the idea of conformality. And you can see from, as this scrolls through the axial images, the contours that are outlined here. We have the lymph node volumes, which were prescribed to go to 4,500, and then the high dose PTV volume, which was prescribed to go to 5040. And then also with the organs at risk that were provided, you have the bowel, the bladder, the genitalia, and also the iliac crest and femoral heads. So a typical anal case, you can see the patient here is supine, and as we go through, you can see just the complexity of the volumes themselves made it a very challenging case. When we blow this image up, you can see with the close proximity of the low-dose lymph nodes and the high-dose PTV, as we would experience in a real-world environment, it's really presented some challenges in terms of controlling dose bleed-off and getting the right amount of coverage while still sparing the organs at risk. And really just the enormous volume of the PTVs itself made it a very challenging case. And as we kind of went through this video, you may have picked up on the fact that there was contours provided, and as part of the plan challenge, we do provide all of the gold contours, even though we know variability is an issue. And just as this little cartoon represents, we know that contouring can be that elephant in the room. We know there's a high degree of variability with contouring. We've actually run several contour challenges highlighting the variability with interplanar and even interphysician that was published in the Red Journal. But for this project, we wanted to eliminate as many variables as possible and really just evaluate planning on its own. And so what we provided was a set of metrics, and really it was just a list of clinical goals that would be common to a case such as this. And we listed them out, things like target coverage, global max location, organ at risk sparing, and we designed a very quick and easy way to score those. So in other words, for target coverage, it may be more heavily weighted with 20 points versus an organ at risk, which may be a lower weighted type of thing, maybe closer to the 5-point scale. Anyway, as we looked at the overall components, and I believe there was close to 20 metrics with this particular plan challenge, when we added up all the individual scores for each of these things, the total sum score totaled 150, and that was really an unachievable score, but that was the total max points that if you added them up, the sum total of which we refer to as the PQM, or plan quality metric. And so as the plans were returned, we could use our software to analyze all of the individual metrics. So what this is showing is one DVH. It's a drill down page highlighting one metric from the PTV 5040. So the V 50.4 gray in percent, we captured that, and then there was a related score with that. So in this particular case, the metric value was 95.5, and the associated score was the max allowable points, which was 30 in this case. And so this would be a representative scorecard. And if this was an actual submitted plan, you can see all the individual metrics, including target coverage, the conformality indices, the organs at risk, 19 total metrics, and then what's circled at the bottom is the PQM score out of 150. Once we have the score, we're able to then use a population distribution. And what I mean by that is these blue bars represent a relative perspective of the total plans submitted. So what you're looking at now is the 157 data points from all the plans that were submitted for this year's plan challenge, and this yellow line would represent one individual plan. So if in this case this PQM score was 123.67, this gives you an idea of, in relation to the mean value, the max value, and the min value, which all of those data points are listed at the top, where that individual fell in relation to all of the plans submitted. So just a really nice perspective. And also what these distributions show is that variability. So whether it was confusion on the metrics that were to be analyzed or under normalizing targets, all the way up to the highest performing scores, this just lays all of the data points out in a nice histogram view. And our goal as a company is to just analyze the data and then provide avenues to help minimize some of that variability and provide some tips and tricks on how to accomplish that. So after listening to that lengthy explanation of this performance record or distribution, it may still be a little confusing. So if you think about it in terms of, as you've been listening to this presentation, if I was to collect data points on the number of times that you've been sort of drifting off or thinking about something else or being somewhere else other than listening to this, and collected all that data and graphed it from the number of times that that was occurring, that would represent these blue bars and the number of times that you would be thinking about that. Another way to think about it is, let's say we looked at the number of times that an average person combed their hair. And let's say the average person is 1 or 4 times a day versus maybe Kyle Velasco at ROR, who combs his hair at least 15 times a day. And I believe this is an actual snapshot of the comb that he uses. So the performance records can be very valuable. And one of the things that we know with the PQM idea is that we were heading down a path that was going to give us a better idea of how to analyze overall plan quality. But we also discovered that the metrics aren't always perfect. We're getting better and better at sort of capturing everything that we want to capture without missing some things that, from the subjective point of view, a physician or someone doing the plan may not necessarily like. And what I mean by that is kind of gaming the system to get a high PQM score and sort of blatantly ignoring some of the metrics that may be laid out. In other words, for one of the prostate plans that was submitted that had an extremely high score, it was a very conformal plan. It met all of the individual metrics that we had done in years past, and we noticed there was some dose bleed off, some dose islanding, in one of the head and neck challenges that we ran, a similar concept where it was a high scoring plan, but some of the dose bleed off around the cord and maybe outside the PTV volumes weren't necessarily being captured. So we've looked at ways to minimize this from happening, both the gaming of the system to achieve just a high score and ignoring the clinical relevance, and knowing that there was opportunities for improvement with incorporating more metrics. So one of our solutions to this, I guess, quote unquote, problem was introducing things like a confirmation number. And these great metrics that are published a lot of times may go unused in the clinic. Perhaps the technology makes it not very easy to use. It's, the whole idea of incorporating something like this may add elements of or degrees of time that we don't have. But, in this publication by Van Riet, the confirmation number is something that we've used now with the last couple plan challenges, and we've found it very valuable. And what it does is it goes beyond the well-known conformality index, which just looks at the volume of a target and a volume of an isodose line. This actually it's a true measure of how much that dose is shrink wrapping around that volume. And so it's a great way to give you an understanding of how conformal the isodose lines are around a particular PTV or outlined structure that you're trying to get dose around. One of the other solutions that we came up with trying to decrease the variability and improve the clinical relevance behind the plans being submitted was looking at these deliverability concepts and the efficiency concepts. And what we mean by that is this physics checklist. Within the software itself, we could outline various things like number of beams, couch angles used, the grid spacing, how many total monitor units, control points, just a wide variety of stuff. And we plugged that into the software. We included that with this year's prescription. So ahead of time, you knew exactly what was going to be analyzed. And one of the layers to even achieving a score was passing this physics checklist. I'll show a brief video that highlights what I'm talking about. This slide shows the scorecard, but not in a quantitative way. In other words, there's no PQM score. This is just an ideal, an acceptable, or a failure. So what we did that was unique for this year's plan challenges, we noticed in years past that even some of the high scoring plans would almost blatantly ignore one or two of the metrics that didn't have a very high point value. So to avoid that, because we all know that a plan clinically would not get approved if it didn't meet a minimum threshold by the physician, or at least striving to achieve every single line item. And by using the quality report software, we could establish just a pass-fail. So we had a minimum threshold, and then we had more of a benchmark or an ideal value to achieve. And we could look at both the pass-fail, and we could look at it in terms of an actual score. So this is the same scorecard, just flipped to look at each individual metric and associated score, and then that total score, which was the PQM. So all of these things combined, it was just our way to improve the project this year. This video shows how we actually scored the plan using the software. It's a DICOM compatible tool, like I mentioned before. It's called Quality Reports EMR. It's a product we actually distribute and we use on a clinical basis, but it's the foundation behind our plan challenge, and it allows us to do some really great things very efficiently and quickly. What this is showing now is bringing in the DICOM files, running the physics checklist, creating a scorecard with all of the various physics parameters, and you can see there's a wide variety of ones to choose from. Also, what we could do was navigate through the planes just like any treatment planning system. The unique thing about this was a third-party objective tool, so we could, regardless of the planning system, load in our templates and look at the dose values around the contours. We could also interact with the DVH. And with the quality tab, this was really the differential with the software. As I mentioned before, we could look at the scorecards in terms of passing each metric on a minimum level, and then we could hit this toggle switch and analyze the score. So we established these scores up front, and we had these sort of like an RTOG protocol would have, where you have these variance levels. We could look at things like global max location, whether that was falling in the GTV or PTV or outside of it. And then once we had a score, we could click this PQM button and throw it into the overall distribution. So that yellow line again representing where this individual scored in relation to all of the plans submitted. From there, we could generate a quick PDF report that was customized for every individual, and then populate also in that distribution within the report. And so that's the great thing about using this quality reports software is generating these full PDF reports and being able to analyze this data very quickly. So beyond just knowing where we all stand and taking the time to do a plan and maybe receive some valuable information based on what others are doing, there was extra incentive to be involved, and we've given some announcements on this prior to running the project. The prizes included for the top 10%, they would be eligible for a $500 Visa gift card. Those attending the AAMD meeting also had greater opportunities to win some additional prizes, but really what we love is the fact that we could recognize all the high performers with the presentations through the website, and we try to break them down into different categories and dissect the data in a variety of ways, looking at the different treatment planning systems and the different countries of involvement. So there's a lot of cool stuff that we'll get to. And there was some other incentives for participating, which I'll talk about at the very, very end. One of the questions that we get a lot is, well, can you give me some idea on what does a PQM score look like in terms of if I was looking at a plan, could you sort of throw these scores into a bucket and have a general idea of what that score means? And I'll show you some examples of what I'm talking about. So one example would be to look at the PQM scores that were in this 130 to 140 category. As I mentioned before, 150 was the total maximum possible score, at least when you added up all the individual metrics. But with all the trade-offs of the plan, it really was an unachievable score. So when we were looking at scores above a 130, for us, it was well above the mean, and the clinical significance or the differences, at least from a subjective point of view, didn't seem to be very much, even with the scores that were above a 140. But in general, these are just general trends. Scores that were in this bucket, they passed every metric, including the physics checklist. The target coverage was always met. Because those were weighted so high, you really couldn't get a score that was above a 130 if you didn't meet the target coverage. The organ at risk sparing was above average. There was a high degree of conformity based on subjective examination. Definitely average to above average conformity, and that was looking at things like dose islanding or dose bleed off. So these were above average on the scale of just going through it and looking at it with as you were traversing through the planes on the CT. The global max location was typically in the CTV or PTV. And we could tell that there was some advanced techniques, whether that was rotating the collimator or just incorporating some additional contours to really address this idea of conformality, because there was a lot of importance weighting placed on that this year. And so from a visual standpoint, as I mentioned, the scores were in this 130 range. They were very good plans. They weren't always perfect. I mean, looking at improving our metrics and looking at the plans, we noticed things like some dose islanding. But overall, the plans were homogeneous. They were very conformal. They did a good job of conforming the low dose, meeting all the individual goals that were outlined up front. As you dip down below 130, some of the general trends that we noticed, the physics checklist was only passed maybe 75% of the time. Target coverage was generally achieved, again, because they were weighted so high. To get a score above a 120 would be pretty difficult without meeting target coverage. The organ at risk sparing was average to above average. And the conformity indices weren't as great as the previous plans that we just discussed. It started to kind of dip down more on the low side, and I'll show some examples of that. The definitely average to above average if you looked at it subjectively, but in terms of the actual numeric metric, they were lower. And the global max location was generally in the PTV. Sometimes these plans, kind of one of the general trends is we noticed that they're running more on the hot side overall. So this image here is showing one of the plans submitted, and I believe the score was around a 123, which the scorecard here is on the bottom left. Overall, not a bad plan, very conformal. Most of the metrics were being met. You can see that the ones that are lighting up orange or red are some of those conformity indices, the confirmation number, the homogeneity index, things like that. And you can see visually what that homogeneity index means. It's kind of a tip-to-tail analysis of the PTV. So in other words, looking at the top shoulder of a PTV on a DVH and then where the tail would be at the bottom. And the steeper the line, the better the homogeneity index. So in other words, the more straight up and down the DVH would be, the better the homogeneity index on the DVH. But visually, you could correlate that with an image like this, where when you're looking at those kind of splotchy, more red dose regions, not as homogeneous as some of the 140 plus plans, which we'll show here in a second. And just another graphic to illustrate, and this is more on the low dose regions, a little bit of dose spray off here. This was a plan that was submitted that was around a 131. When you look at the lymph node regions, again, not as homogeneous as some of the higher scoring plans. And examining some of the PQM scores that were less than, let's say, and again, this is rounding, and not all the plans specifically were following every bullet item here, but this was just a general trend. When you look at the scores around a 115 or lower, we're about 50-50 at this point on the physics checklist. In other words, maybe the number of beams didn't satisfy the limit that we had put out, or there was just something that was off on the physics checklist. There was a lack of target coverage. A lot of times these plans tended to be under-normalized. The organ at risk sparing many times wasn't as great. One example was one of the plans submitted had close to a 90% V30 on the rectum minus PTV structure. And probably the biggest struggle point on these, and this was something that we're kind of learning and still getting our arms around on how to manipulate all of the TPS systems to control some of these various published metrics. We wanted to really look at the conformity this year. And so those plans scoring less than a 115 tended to be on the low side with some of those numeric metrics. Perhaps the global max location, and this wasn't a very heavily weighted thing, it may be outside the PTV on a lot of these plans, but just in general, not in alignment with a lot of the outline goals. So this may be an example here of one of the scorecards, and you can see some of the line items that are lighting up red and orange, signifying kind of a lower performance on those things. And again, the most challenging ones to achieve seem to be in line with those metrics. And this is a visual that shows some of that dose bleed off. You can see some of the blotchy, kind of darker regions that are falling outside of the defined volume, so perhaps some rings or things like that, just to kind of tighten up the dose conformality. But the PQM was definitely capturing those plans that showed things such as this. And so when we had kind of gotten to the point where we would bring in a plan, we could almost predict the PQM score within 5 or 10 points, which was encouraging because that told us that there was a high degree of significance as you went up the scale with the PQM score. The better the overall quality of the plan was being represented. When you look at a plan like this that was below 100, you would like to be able to predict that when you first looked at this compared to some of the very conformal plans that were scoring a 140, if you could predict that this would fall where it did, you would think that you designed a list of metrics that was doing its job. And that's kind of what we saw with all of the 150 plus plans that were submitted, was that although the metrics aren't perfect, they seem to do a pretty good job, both from an objective point of view and looking at the plan subjectively. So now some of the higher scoring plans that went over a 140, they generally passed every metric, including the physics checklist, the target coverage, the organ at risk sparing. The conformity was really high. The global max location tended to fall within the GTV or CTV of the high dose volume. There was a high degree of conformity based on just looking at it subjectively, and definitely some advanced techniques being used. But you can see just visually what we're describing here. Very homogeneous, not a lot of blotchiness with the dose color wash. The low dose regions were very controlled, and we tried to be consistent when we captured these screen images. In other words, every color is defining a specific value every single time, and that blue region is looking at that 30 gray mark. And so you can see that these plans really did a good job of tightening up the dose. The DVH lines on the target coverages were very vertical, meeting the defined metrics that were outlined up front. And then the organ at risk, those were all spared significantly, at least what we felt like was achievable for a plan like this. Some of the things that we noticed, and again, we're not 100% on this, things like fluence editing on eclipse, or looking at, using advanced techniques, collimator angles, just incorporating some things that would help with the overall conformality, the homogeneity, achieving target coverage, and the organ at risk sparing. So why should any of this matter to you as a dosimetrist? If you do treatment planning, why would going through these PQM scores and having any interest at all in a plan challenge project, why would that matter to you in the clinic? And what we go back to is we look at kind of where we're at now. And if we go general for a second, if we look at the bad economy, this broken health system, there's this whole cloud of fear in our industry with all these sensational New York Times articles, this idea of automated technologies. Are we going to be replaced? Are jobs at risk? I know that I speak for a lot of people when, our local hospital, we've been on budget freezes, and, even though we feel like we're doing twice the work that we were before, we're still not allowed to hire someone new. And, from a broader perspective, the hospitals are looking at ways to cut cost and to, because there's this uncertainty with the future. The reality is, if we can't operate in fear, and the one way to mitigate that is, or at least if you would use the phrase guaranteed success, is to look at the things we can control. We can't control a lot of those other things, but the things that we can control is self-learning, participating in a peer-based quality system or a continual learning program, learning through this idea of trial and error. And I put the word error in quotation marks because, we like to use that phrase in the scientific method, but for me, at least in when you're working in a continual learning environment on, in a plan challenge type of approach where you're not working on an actual patient, this idea of error kind of goes away. There is no such thing as an error, because if you maybe didn't score as high as you would have liked, you can learn from that. And so that's where I think this project becomes very valuable. And we've developed some training programs using similar philosophies where by measuring, we can actually move towards this area of improvement. Improving quality through measurement really, we believe, is the future, not just in healthcare, but in a lot of different industries. When you look at this most recent split with the ACR and Astro, when you drill down and look at Astro's program, they're really looking at things that are going to be, focused on treatment planning, the qualifications and the ongoing training of staff, but doing it on a more evidence-based way, looking at ways to objectively look at and measure quality. And ultimately, we may be looking as an industry at getting reimbursed only when you can prove that quality. And so that's one great thing about this project, is we've incorporated a lot of the philosophies that you see in manufacturing and other industry in terms of measuring quality, using metrics and this whole idea of measurement to quantify quality. One of the unique things that we did this year for the Plan Challenge, and we wanted to try to innovate every year, that is one of our goals. We decided at the beginning that we wanted to have this survey, this whole theme of Plan Your Plan Challenge. So we designed a survey. We wanted to see what other people were doing with a similar type of plan. So we constructed this survey and we submitted it out to all the participants. And why would we do something like that? In this world, I heard this story once, and it kind of is relevant here. And that was, one day a husband noticed that his wife was cooking a ham, and she had the ends of the ham cut off. And he asked her, "Why do you do that?" And she kind of paused and she thought about it. And she said, "Well, I don't know. My mom always cut the ends of the ham off, and she always had the best tasting ham in the world. And so I've just followed her recipe, and that's what I've always done." And so they decided, well, let's ask your mom why she does that. So they go to the grandmother and they ask her, "Grandma, you have the best tasting ham in the world. Why is it that you always cut the ends of the ham off?" And she goes, "Well, that's easy. My pan's too small." And so the analogy here is that a lot of times we do things because someone else showed us the way, and we're not really digging a little bit deeper and determining, okay, why is it that we're doing these things? Are we just doing them because that's the way I learned from the person sitting next to me? Is there other things that we could be doing or looking at? And that was kind of one of the reasons that we put this pre-survey out before the Plan Challenge launched. We wanted to see what other people were doing and to try to innovate and to grasp, concepts that maybe we would be missing. And when we put the survey out, we had a wide variety of people that participated. As you can see from this illustration here, this outlines that we had people participate beyond the radiation therapist and dosimetrist. We even had some radiation oncologists participate, medical physicists. In total, we had 195 responses to the survey. One of the other questions that we asked in the survey was, have you participated in a previous Plan Challenge? And this was the results. About 40% had participated in a previous Plan Challenge, and about 60% had not. We wanted to look at some different parameters when it came to defining plan quality. And so we asked to rank in order of most importance, one being the highest, between target coverage, organ at risk sparing, and conformity. Target coverage was generally the highest response in terms of analyzing plan quality. Second was organ at risk sparing, and third was the idea of conformity. And that kind of followed pretty well the way we broke down our metrics. We had about 50 points associated with the organ at risk sparing, about 70 points for the target coverage, and about 30 points overall for the conformity metrics. We asked the question, do you use a specific protocol in your clinic when it comes to treating anal cancer? And about 70% said no. And we had a wide variety of answers on this, but the most common protocol, if there was one that was used religiously or one that was most commonly followed, it was the RTOG 0529 study. This was a phase 2 evaluation of dose-painted IMRT in combination with 5-FU and mitomycin C. It outlined everything. It was really the go-to study for a treatment like this. This outlined everything from the fractionation scheme, the treatment options, and really stressed the idea of looking at IMRT for allowing for better organ preservation, better dose sparing. It outlines all the risk factors and the histologies and their 5-year survival rates. It also went into a great description of the common prescription to use, the positioning, the use of contrast, PTV margins, and lists out the critical structures and target constraints that would need to be utilized. Really, the survey laid out some methods that one of the goals was to look at simplifying and increasing the uniformity of the entire process so that in the future, IMRT would become more of a standard for treating patients this way. And so we used that as our inspiration to design some of the metrics that we used for the plan challenge. We asked, what is most commonly used in your clinic in terms of defining target coverage? 95% was the overwhelming response. We had other responses like 98%, 95 at 95. We use ICRU 83, just a wide variety of responses. But as you can see from this graph, 74% of people used 95% coverage of the PTV volume. So that's what we utilized in the metric. So if you were to look at a DVH and analyzing the shoulder of the curve for the PTVs, we were looking at 95%. We asked the question, do you consider global max location as part of your assessment of the overall plan quality? And overwhelmingly, 92% of people said yes, that is a consideration. This was an interesting one when it came to how do you define this idea of hotness of the plan. Do you define it with a maximum point dose that's reported by the treatment planning system? Do you look at an absolute volume in cc's at a specific dose? I think the industry as a whole looks like we're moving towards this idea of not just looking at one little voxel that's reported by the TPS, but looking at things more from an absolute volume standpoint. And as you can see from the survey responses, it was the second most common way to analyze the overall hotness of a plan. And so the follow-up to that was, and this was maybe a bad question to ask, but we wanted to get a general concept or general idea of what others were doing and what their physicians would allow in terms of saying this plan is too hot. And 110 seemed to be the most common response. We had a lot of other answers here as well that may have been outside the choices that are outlined. You can see that 24% answered something that was outside of the 105, 110, 115, and 120. And those answers ranged anywhere from, providing a specific number like 107, or we, look at something other than what you've outlined here. But overwhelmingly, it was 110 seemed to be the most common. When it came to the organ at risk sparing, we asked the question to rank in order of most importance with the structures that are listed here: small bowel, iliac crest, femoral heads, external genitalia, and bladder, to rank those in order. In other words, which one would you try to spare first over the other ones? And that's a little difficult to say. We absolutely do this every time, but we just wanted to get a general idea of how to score the metric. So the answers that we received were very helpful. And small bowel was the one that was ranked the highest most consistently. And the one that was ranked the least important was the iliac crest. And when you look at, let's say, a female pelvis protocol for GYN, you will see in there a pretty heavy importance placed on sparing the iliac crest and this idea of, trying to spare the bone marrow that would be within that region, so that when a patient's going through treatment, their blood counts don't nosedive and they can't, come every day for their treatment. There's an interesting publication that references that we'll talk about in a second, but this was helpful in terms of designing the overall scoring for each individual metric. The other three structures were kind of weighted equally. We asked the question, do you look at the area that's outside the PTV with the rectum? So the target generally would cover a large portion of the rectum, but there a lot of times will be this area of large bowel, sigmoid, whatever, that is outside the target volume. And is that something to consider with sparing the dose? And it was interesting because 67% of the responses were, yes, we do look at sparing that structure that's outside the PTV, or at least, and probably the most common response was not one defined metric, although there were some that pointed towards a V30 value. The most common answer was this idea of ALARA, just keeping it as low as possible. We asked the question, what is the most common energy you would use for a case like this? 6 MV was the second most common. 10 MV was actually the most common response for a case like this, because of not everyone having access to that energy, consider the Tomo users that was going to be submitting plans. We wanted to minimize the number of variables that that we would run into, and so the easy answer for us was most people that would be doing the plan would have access to a 6MV beam, and so that's what we used for this year's plan challenge. We kind of agree with the idea of using mixed energies. We do it a lot with some of our own clinical plans. So we asked the question, would you consider using a mixed energy for a case like this? And the answers were split, about 50-50. It's interesting because we're seeing some publications that are flying out there that sort of address this idea of neutron production, and we do know of several clinics that will allow the use of high energy, especially in combination with lower energy, and so that was an interesting question. Another question was, would you consider the use of non-coplanar beams or arcs for a pelvis case? And 63% said yes, that we would allow that in our clinic. We decided after kind of a lengthy discussion to just, keep it simple and not allow couch kicks for this. So that way it would kind of level the playing field, keep things a little bit more standard. Not that it was the right or wrong answer. That was just the way we decided to go in this year's plan challenge. We looked at unique beam geometries. So for static and for VMAT, we wanted to get an idea of what would be the most commonly used number of arcs or beams. So for static IMRT, the most common response was 9 beam angles. And for VMAT, it was the use of 2 arcs. Because 3 arcs are somewhat common, we decided for this plan challenge to allow up to 3 arcs, and that was probably the most common beam arrangement, if you will, for this year's plan challenge was for the VMAT plans was to use 3 arcs. I felt like this was a very interesting question. We asked the question, would you treat a patient with a case such as this, supine or prone? And I think this really represents kind of a paradigm shift in our field. 5 years ago, or definitely 10 years ago, if we asked the same question, it would be maybe a mixture of the two or completely opposite, where you would see more of a heavy distribution towards prone. And there's a lot of studies that have been done on this. And in fact, the most recent studies have shown that clinically, when you look at the plans, there really isn't a wide difference or a great difference between having the patient lying supine or prone. And what they found was that when the patient is lying supine, it's usually more reproducible. And so I think we're seeing this become the standard. And in fact, for this year's plan challenge, that was what we opted to do, was choose a data set where the patient was lying supine. Another question was full or empty bladder. About 88% of people that responded said, yes, we try to simulate the patient with the bladder being full to try to push the bowel out of the way. And then so we asked the question, how do you contour the small bowel for a case like this? Do you contour individual loops of bowel, or do you consider the bulk volume of the bowel? And the most common answer was we contour a bulk volume that would represent all the areas where the bowel would be on a day-to-day basis. The RTOG 0529 paper referenced this, and there's some great contouring atlases on the subject if you're interested. And actually, I included a link here on the talk. If you want to look up this RTOG contouring atlas, it's available online. It was actually a follow-up study in response to the 0529 initial study where they saw a lot of variability with the contouring, so they thought a contouring atlas would be very well received and much needed. What's interesting, I believe this contouring atlas is prone, even though a lot of us are treating our patients supine. The organ at risks were not included. There is a discussion on femoral heads and bowel and how to approach those in terms of contouring. There's no mention of iliac crests or bone marrow in there. One of the other questions that we asked in the survey was was in regards to that and talking about PTV margins. So this one was all over the map. There was really no, or it seemed like it was hard to pin down a defined standard from everybody that participated in the survey. We had responses everywhere from 2 to 25 millimeters, depending on the volume that was under consideration. And when you look at the RTOG 0529 and what we most commonly see clinically, it's generally about a centimeter. But there is a great, if you look up this Australian GI trial group, this was a great paper that came out, and it looked at IMRT and VMAT playing an increasing role in treating anal cancers. They address this idea of contouring is very critical, and the study provides a great atlas. It came out in 2010 for both targets and organ at risk volumes. They give guidelines for margins, and if you just Google this Australian GI trial group, this AGITG, it's pretty easy to locate. They give some great recommendations. I think with the PTV volumes, they recommend 5 to 10 millimeters for involved lymph nodes, 10 to 20 millimeters, and 8 to 10 millimeters for uninvolved lymph nodes, and then the primary PTV 20 millimeters actually. So being a little bit more generous with the margins, even with the use of IGRT. It was interesting because they said they weren't going to provide, or they did not provide, any dose constraints due to the lack of data and variability that was out there. So we tried to compile, metrics and dose constraints from a wide variety of sources when it came to compiling everything into this comprehensive PQM. One of the things that we didn't want to ignore, at least dig a little bit deeper on, was this idea of bone marrow sparing. When you look at a lot of the studies that came out of UCSD and the University of Chicago with Dr. Munt and Dr. Ruski, there's a lot of great references, and we had a GYN plan challenge several years ago, which talked a lot about this subject, and there was recommendations for sparing the iliac bone marrow and how to contour those areas and analyze lower dose areas on the DVH like the V20, the V10, and introducing this concept of not just looking at the iliac crest, but also considering the sacrolumbar bone marrow area where perhaps that is even of greater importance to examine and to try to conform your dose. And it led us to do a little bit of investigating and sort of ask the question, well, for these anal rectal cases, why are we not looking at sparing bone marrow? We had a hard time finding publications and references to this. And actually our local physician, Dr. Wheeler, talked about, perhaps why we don't typically see plans or address this as heavily as we do with, let's say, a cervical patient. And he talked about the idea of the chemo drugs that were involved. So one of the biggest differences that we see is this use of mitomycin C, 5-FU, which maybe perhaps in this paper here by Milano et al. Kind of touched on this with this quote, that perhaps those drugs are so toxic that you're not going to see drastic improvements with IMRT. And that's what our local physician had stated, and this paper sort of backed that statement up. But they did say, as one of the conclusions in the paper, that we need to do more investigating on the subject, and we need to consider, running more future studies on sparing bone marrow for anal rectal cases with IMRT and VMAT. So just to wrap up the pre-survey question, we asked, what's the most common form of delivery in your clinic? And sometimes it was split. The question was set up where you could check all that apply. So we saw, common 3D and IMRT being used at the same time, VMAT and TOMO, of course. But again, just kind of stressing the point that IMRT and VMAT have an increasing role with cases like this. And I think we referenced the folks at MD Anderson, Matt Palmer, and Mary Farm, who looked at class solutions, and this was specific to IMRT benchmarks and class solutions for anal malignancies. And these are some great references for dose constraints that they used with their class solutions. And basically what we mean by that is taking a whole crop of plans with similar prescriptions and anatomy, and having planners run numerous plans on these to come up with what they felt like was ideal beam arrangements, ideal energy, ideal optimization techniques, and really trying to go down the path of what is achievable. If you Google this class solutions IMRT benchmarks for anal malignancies, it's very easy to find, but these are just some defined dose constraints that were referenced in that talk. Okay, so finally, the data from this year's plan challenge. We've talked a lot about this idea of metrics, and I would admit that when we first started this idea, talking to Dr. Ben Nelms about using metrics and using quantitative ways to define plan quality, I can honestly say that I don't think I was drinking the Kool-Aid. I don't think any of us were. In fact, we probably felt more like this guy. We just wanted to smash the Kool-Aid. But after we've spent some time, using metrics and incorporating it into the plan challenge project, we're big believers. We're definitely drinking the Kool-Aid. We are fully on board with this idea of measuring quality. You cannot improve what you don't measure, and this idea of having quantified scores with common clinical goals, using published metrics to define overall plan quality, to map it out in a way such as we're doing here with this histogram view, looking at the median, the mean, the min and max values, and doing deeper dives to look at why are plans scoring the way they do. Are there opportunities to minimize this variability as an industry, and really specifically for this project? So we definitely are on board with this idea of metrics, and I'm going to present some of the data and the results here very quickly. But before I do, I want to thank all of the vendors, because they were instrumental in helping us to market the project, to get the word out about the value in participating. And a lot of the folks that work at these companies are clinicians themselves. And I truly believe that a lot of these individuals, they not only believe very strongly in the idea of the plan challenge and measuring plan quality and knowing that their specific treatment planning system is, doing the best it can possibly do, but as individuals, they've all participated and actually submitted plans for the plan challenge. So that, tells us, hey, they're taking the time to know what the best practices are for their system, and they want to know, even from an individual standpoint, that they're doing everything that they can. So a lot of credit to those companies and to the individuals that work at those companies for helping us with this year's plan challenge. What this graph here is showing is an overlay of a distribution. So at the top we have Eclipse, then Monaco, Pinnacle, Ray Station. We had 4 submitted plans this year, and Tomo. And you can see the dose statistics there are the kind of the analytical statistics there at the top, where you have the number of plans submitted, the min value, the max value, and the mean value, and of course the standard deviation. This was interesting when you looked at the PQM score in relation to the treatment planning system, just reading from left to right. This is max score. So we have Eclipse, Monaco, Pinnacle, Ray Station, and Tomotherapy. And then looking at the median scores, again, left to right, Eclipse, Monaco, Pinnacle, Ray Station, and Tomotherapy. And with this idea of the PQM, we could then correlate those scores with the pre-survey questions that were filled out by the participants ahead of time. So here, this graph is showing the PQM score relative to the year's experience. Really, the R value kind of dictates, the idea of those values being correlated. There's two there. You can look at data and you can interpret it. Sometimes you can twist it to kind of read what it is you want it to read. How we interpret this is not that years of experience aren't important, because they are. And you see that some of the low scores are kind of weeded out the further you go to the right. But I think what we focus on is this idea of having access to the right technology, training, ways of measuring quality, that regardless of the years of experience you have, that achieving a high score, at least on this particular case, is possible. And this is a trend that we've seen pretty much with every plan challenge we've done up to this point. We could also graph things On top here, you have the PQM relative to CMD certification. On the bottom, with all the dose statistics outlined, a non-CMD versus PQM. And again, just keeping in mind that we had a lot of international participants, and being CMD certified, or we had some physicists that submitted plans that isn't, the importance weighting isn't there for those individuals, so you have to take that into consideration as well. This slide is showing the educational background versus PQM. So we have JCERT programs, non-JCERT programs, and those OJT are trained on the job. The end value of the plan submitted, the min, the max, and all of the statistics there that are outlined. We could look at the PQM versus confidence level. So we asked, we've done this the past few years, the question, 5 being the most confident, 1 not being very confident at all, how do you feel about this particular case, or even doing IMRT or VMAT in general, and looking at that relative to PQM. So you can see the confidence level on the bottom, the PQM there on the left, and really not a lot of correlation there. So here we are again looking at these crazy blue bar graphs, these distributions, and what this is showing is we took all of the individual metrics and we could look at it with a histogram view. So in other words, this is the target coverage, and looking at it relative to the number of people, the number of plans, and where they ranked, with the percentage getting V or 50.4 gray on this particular volume. But what we could do was we took that histogram and then put it on a scatter plot. And what this was really examining was what do from an individual metric standpoint, are there some that more heavily correlated with overall plan quality? And of course, target coverage definitely was one of those, but that was probably more due to the fact that we heavily weighted those in terms of points. And we saw the same thing for the 4500 volume, where this R value is showing a strong correlation between target coverage and the overall PQM score. We looked at things like the rectum V30, and we could graph this out with histogram with all the submitted plans, but then look at it with relative to the overall PQM score. And basically what this told us, and you could see from the trend line and the R value, the R value itself was close to like a 0.66, and anything above a 0.4 you would say is statistically significant. And so when we looked at the overall plan quality, basically to sum this up, those that did a good job sparing the rectum minus PTV structure had tended to have an overall higher PQM score. Now, of course, there were things like the femoral heads, where everyone, pretty much was able to achieve the defined metrics. There wasn't a great deal of challenge when it came to, conforming the dose off those structures. They just kind of inherently met the metrics that were defined. So, looking at the R value here, you're not going to see a strong correlation with overall plan quality related to just the femoral heads. So we could look at a lot of various things. I'll kind of go through these very quickly. The hotness of the plan and the way that it correlated with the overall PQM score. Things like the conformality index. We saw a lot of correlation between conformality index and the total PQM score. And I know these graphs tend to kind of drone on, but there really is a lot of value in looking at these things. We're trying to digest all this data for some time now, and we're going to summarize all this great information and in some future publications. I guess some of the take-home points for us was when you look at things like the homogeneity index and the confirmation number especially, these are just some great individual metrics to look at and examine beyond just looking at the isodose levels and the DVH. To really drill down and look at metrics like this can be really valuable from a clinical standpoint. The key is just trying to find a software or a way to compile this data quickly and make it meaningful. And what I mean by that is, when you look at this scatter plot, could you make the conclusion that a high confirmation number would give you an overall better plan or an overall higher PQM score. And the trend line and the R value would definitely say, because the R value is like a 0.6 in this case, would say yes. But isn't it absolute? And the answer is no. When you look at one of the outliers here that had the highest confirmation number, but one of the lower overall PQM scores, that pretty much summarizes the fact that you can't just look at one metric and say, yes, my plan is good, or yes, I have great plan quality. Just because you have a high confirmation number doesn't mean that your plan quality is the best it can absolutely be, at least in this case. What it's saying is that it's an important factor to consider in the overall plan analysis. So just using it in combination with other metrics. And so we'll wrap up all of these crazy graphs and boring distributions, and we're not putting these out there just to show how smart we are or to lay out this data that has no meaning. We hope that at least in examining some of these data points that we can take something practically away from it and apply it on a daily basis to not only our clinical plans, but really trying to strive towards improving. And for me, personally, and the way that we use it here in our company and with our own clinical plans is we analyze, new technologies, new staff. We do our performance evaluations on a yearly basis. It's part of our training program. And this slide shows where the ROR submitted plans fell on the first iteration as we developed this data set and the metrics as a group, how we ranked. And so what we were doing, regardless of experience or your overall knowledge or comfort level on a specific system, this allows us to baseline, to kind of do more of a drill down and look for areas of potential improvement. But one of the most powerful things for us was a group that we've worked with in the past that about a year ago, we ran a similar type of an assessment. They were just getting their IMRT program started, and these yellow lines represent the variability against a backdrop distribution of where they ranked as a group. And there was several physicists that were doing planning, and after having access to great technology and simple processes and training and coming together to define clinical goals and practices and processes that they wanted to strive for, that same group in this year's plan challenge were some of the highest scoring plans that we saw. In fact, on the Pinnacle treatment planning system, represented by these yellow lines, when you looked at the overall distribution, these 7 individuals all ranked in the top 10 overall for not only the overall distribution, but for the Pinnacle static distribution as well. Okay, so our most probably, or at least the favorite part of why we run this project is our ability to recognize those that did a good job. I think it's rare in this industry of doing treatment planning that you get a pat on the back. And so on the next few slides, we are going to outline, and this is a breakdown per treatment planning system, the individuals that submitted some of the highest scoring plans. And so you can see those individuals here, the name and institution, and then the PQM score to the far right. This was Monaco. And the next slide, this is Pinnacle. And you can see, again, from Montreal, the institution here with all the individuals that ranked extremely high in this year's plan challenge, which was very encouraging to see. And you can see the PQM scores ranged from a 139 to a 135. And we had representatives from all over the world on Pinnacle. And Race Station, we had 2 top scoring plans, and the PQM scores there on the right, 141 and a 135. For Tomo, these are the top finishers. PQM scores ranging from 145 to 137. And Eclipse, some of the highest scoring plans actually on this list. The highest scoring plan overall, 146.79. down to a 140. And we just wanted to recognize some of the top performers on our website. We're going to have a running list of scores that include, like I said, when we looked and analyzed the PQM scores above a 130, we wanted to recognize those that scored above the mean, and so we'll be posting those on a future date. So one of the most practical things that we did this year that was different, just to wrap this presentation up, was we wanted to compile some tips and tricks from some of those high performers, those that submitted plans that scored really well, and wanted to drill down and see what it was that they were doing, and see if we could share some of those great tips and tricks with everybody. So we asked the question, what special techniques were used to ensure target coverage? And these were some of the answers that we received back. And again, the survey went out to everyone that scored above a 130. And so the answers that we received, we did our best to try to synthesize down the best information to share here. And we'll post, this talk. And if you want more specific information, feel free to contact us. But this was kind of a rundown of some of the most common answers that we received. Obviously, having a higher priority in the optimization. Cleaning the contours was a big one. Using optimization contours to separate, add gradient margins, especially back from the skin with the inguinal nodes. In this case, that was important to consider. Looking at the overlap areas of the organ at risk and the optimization targets, and not just separating, but adding a more defined gradient margin, where based on the dose fall off that you want to achieve, having this area of gradual dose fall off to avoid conflict in the optimization process. This idea of doubling down on optimization structures was one that we've used a lot, and depending on the planning system you're using, it can be valuable. And what I mean by that is not just putting in a min and a max value for a target, but actually entering it in twice can add some extra reminders of importance. And we've had a high degree of success with this whole concept of doubling down on our optimization structures, especially for targets. To control the conformity and the homogeneity inside the PTV, we had a few individuals that said they use actually an inner rind, so not just having a ring on the outer edges of the PTV, but actually having one within the PTV to boost the edge for coverage. And this would be an example of, some screenshots that we took from some plans that we ran to achieve some high scores, using this idea of cropping out the CTV to drive the overall global max location into the GTV or CTV, having rings or gradient margins to better control the dose bleed off and really can create this, high degree of conformity. We asked the question, what special techniques were used when approaching a multiple PTV case? And you're going to see a lot of kind of overlap with some of the answers. Isocenter location was one answer, and we have seen some value in this where you, depending on where you put the isocenter, it might give you an opportunity to increase the efficiency of the delivery, maybe even improve the dose distribution. So putting it close to the high dose PTV, separating the targets, definitely ensuring there's no conflicting objectives, and creating gradient margins definitely helps with that. And here's some screenshots kind of showing what we're talking about. So we have the PTV 45 op structure, which is separated from the higher dose PTV in purple. And then creating rings. With some of the TPS systems, they have some great advanced modules which maybe have lessened the importance of needing to use rings. We still use them depending on what kind of case we're looking at, but really not just putting a uniform ring around something, but looking at the neighboring PTVs and kind of cropping back with increased gradient room depending on what the dose values are and how much conformity you're trying to achieve. So what special techniques for making the plan very conformal? Pushing the rings until the target coverage budges, then stop. 2 normal tissue contours with margin, using non-overlapping rings like I just mentioned. This is an interesting one, and one that we do quite a bit. When you have PTVs that overlap into an organ at risk where you're really concerned about the max dose, instead of trying to fight the optimizer to play this teeter-totter game. We actually will create that overlap area and treat it as a target. So let's say you want 95% coverage on this PTV. By separating that and putting a max value of the prescription dose and the min value at 95% of that prescription dose, you can better control the dose within that area and not have to have those conflicts that occur sometimes in the optimizer. And there you see some examples of some normal tissue structures which are helping to define that 20 gray dose area. What about controlling the plants getting too hot? One of the biggest things and probably the most common response that we saw was just small incremental steps in the planning process. In other words, optimizing to your targets first, then slowly adding in and optimizing to other structures. And then when you're finished running the plan and you feel like you've achieved everything that you can possibly achieve, running it through one last time or maybe a couple more times and using this idea of, I think someone used the phrase wash the plan. And what they mean by that is creating contours from isodose levels going back into the optimizer, let's say 105 hot, converting that to a contour, and then washing those dose values out with a defined priority. Definitely separating targets helps with the homogeneity and not allowing the conflicts in the optimizer to go crazy. And what tends to happen is the overall hotness of the plan gets affected. And this is an example of creating a CTV op structure. So essentially shrinking the CTV or GTV, creating a donut with the PTV, letting the high dose of the overall global max location fall exactly where you want it, and kind of running it with looser priorities in that smaller donut area. What about sparing organ at risk? And while trying to not sacrifice target coverage or conformity, the biggest thing here was addressing the overlap areas, cloning perhaps the organ at risk, separating them from the targets. One of the responses was we hardly had to do anything for this particular plan, which was kind of true. Other than the rectum minus PTV, the other organ at risk structures were fairly easy to achieve because there was more of an importance placed on conformance or conformity. But there's some great responses that I think would apply to other similar cases in the clinic. Using a beam arrangement that would allow for skipping past certain structures and really just approaching the optimization process in general very gently. So optimizing to the targets first and then kind of slowly stepping into the plan. One of the key points I think of value was considering the use of gradient margins not just for targets, but using them for organs at risk. So when you looked at the rectum minus PTV structures and trying to control this 30 gray dose value, cropping that, cloning the structure and then cropping it back a defined distance away from the target to better control the dose. And here we have a picture of Kyle Velasco in college, and he was there at the AAMD meeting to present the awards. And so we have here this graph showing the PQM versus country. So this was kind of interesting to look at, reading from the left to the right: Saudi Arabia, China, Australia, Canada, the United States, and India, and then the relative PQM scores increasing in order. And again, the top 20, so 11 through 20 overall, are listed here, regardless of the planning system. And this was the PQM scores ranging from 137 up to 141. And finally, the top 20 overall, so this would be 1 through 10, and the scores ranging from 141 to 146.79. Shum Gaval from India had the highest PQM score this year for the 2013 plan challenge. So congratulations to everybody that scored really well, and really thank you to everyone for participating. Like I said before, this project would not be possible without all of you participating, and we anticipate some great information to follow, both with publications and things online. So just to wrap it up, finally, we did something unique this year where we wanted to create a top 10 list within the ROR colleagues, based on kind of our experience and talking to people that have participated in our training programs and through the plan challenge. We wanted to put a top 10 list together for IMRT and VMAT best practices. And I don't know if you remember this Office Assistant Clippy, the paper clip that Microsoft used to have in their Office projects, this cheesy little, sometimes not very helpful guy that would pop up. We have our own here at ROR. So this is our top 10 list. Number 10, consistent plan evaluation techniques, having clear, reasonable goals from the physician, getting the prescription prior to planning, just all the basics, just a return to basics was kind of number 10 on the list. Looking at all the various things and just having some consistency with field labels, plan labels, contour names, looking at the isodose lines, and really the biggest thing here was how do we define hotness? When you talk to individuals at different clinics, they have a different definition of what hotness means. Is it the global max of the TPS? Is it where maybe the industry is heading? Is it, this absolute volume at a specific dose? One of the biggest things that we like to do and almost require is to analyze plans with absolute dose. It minimizes the confusion with normalization and really could prevent huge mistakes from happening. If you optimized, for one fraction, and using absolute dose will mitigate a lot of potential risk and harm. So this would be an example of, not using relative dose when you're analyzing your plan, using the absolute dose. Number 9, this idea of normalization. It tends to be still one of the most confusing things, depending on who you're talking to and what treatment planning system you're using. They all use different default settings, so just becoming familiar with those settings and how to manipulate them, what they mean, and printing plans with the actual dose being delivered. There's still, I think, a lot of clinics that are using relative dose and printing plans off that don't show what the actual dose being delivered on the printout. And, just for best practices, I think one of the things where at least we require internally and where we hope the industry may embrace is this idea of not only using absolute dose, but printing the plans with the actual dose being delivered, not having the relative dose show up on the printout with some isodose line that's being chosen, actually normalizing to the DVH and only normalizing the plan to the value that you need to use. Number 8 on the list was using those special treatment planning system specific tools. So each TPS has these very unique things like Eclipse with NTO, Pinnacle with biological. I mean, with Tomo, they have the blocking structures. There's great features within Monaco to use for controlling, dose bleed off. There's just a lot of great specific TPS tools that if you become familiar with, they'll save you a lot of time. And as this bullet says, make those heavy service contracts worth the expense. There's a lot of advanced features that I think go unused within each treatment planning system where just taking the time to kind of know them a little bit better and could save you a lot of time in the planning process and overall increase the plan quality. Fluence editing is a good example. We saw some higher scoring plans this year submitted on the high performer survey that we got back. Some of the response reference this idea of dose painting. It's not available in every treatment planning system, but just one example of some advanced level techniques that could improve the overall plan quality and the efficiency of producing that plan. Number 7 is just approaching the plan very slowly at the beginning, making sure the contours are exactly the way you want them, and not overloading the optimizer at the beginning, just small incremental steps, optimizing to the targets only, evaluating the plan quality, and then just slowly adding the constraints beyond that. One thing to consider is, as I mentioned before, this overlap area. And on this year's plan challenge, the BAL overlapped with pieces of the PTV. So taking a segment such as this overlap area, creating a separate contour, and actually, even though it's within the organ at risk itself, treating it as a target. So defining a max value at the prescription and a min value at 95% of that eliminated some of the conflicts in the optimizer. So just defining that up front could save you some headaches on the back end. Number 6 was building a good foundation with some of the geometry and looking at the target volumes. More beams isn't always better. Sometimes if you have a target volume that's in one hemisphere of the body, just having beams focused in that one area. If you have a more centrally located tumor, maybe a circumferential beam arrangement is the way to go. But just considering varying beam arrangements, sometimes fixing your jaws to improve delivery for VMAT is a great trick to try. Your isocenter placement, and then of course considering using mixed energy. Even hybrid plans are becoming more and more popular. This idea of incorporating 3D with IMRT could improve the overall plan quality. So just considering that great foundation, and this is just kind of a screenshot showing that we had a 5-field plan that was designed for this year's plan challenge that actually scored above what we would say is that high performer threshold, or right at it. And was it as conformal as a 9-field plan? Probably not. But just thinking about the efficiency and this whole idea of maybe having an enormous number of beams isn't always the right answer. So this is one of our CMD, Steve Boyd. He uses this trick a lot, which is collimating. So in other words, for a static IMRT case, looking at each individual beam and then collimating to go perpendicular with the target. But also what happens is it minimizes the interleaf leakage with the delivery of the dose, and it makes the plans overall more homogeneous. And what we would love to see is someone maybe run a study on this, but this concept of collimating the beams leading to better QA results. And what we have found and discovered, we don't have published material on this, but we're getting feedback just subjectively. With this technique, it seems like we're getting higher or better QA predictability and the deliverability of the plan. So it'd be an interesting concept to look deeper into. And if you know of any publications, definitely let us know. But consider using collimator rotation when you set up your beam. So in other words, look at your beam's eye view, have the target turned on, and then rotate the collimator slightly for each beam to have the leaves coming in perpendicular to the target, or even consider just rotating one of the beams 90 degrees seems to improve the dose homogeneity within the target. And that was a common trick that was used with some of the high scores this year with the plan challenge. This is a simple one, number 4, but one that a lot of times I think we get in a hurry, and maybe that we didn't take enough time to analyze the potential conflicts in the optimizer. So analyzing areas where targets overlap or are abutting each other, maybe having priority weighting be the overall end-all answer, trying to spare a certain organ at risk instead of just evaluating it up front and knowing, look, this is not going to be achievable, and running the priority weighting sky high isn't necessarily going to lead to better results. So just keeping it simple and practical. See a lot of references to contours, even though we have these great tools in the treatment planning system. Having the additional contours on, like rings, normal tissues, specific dose control structures, those were commonly used by the highest scoring PQM plans that we received. And definitely this idea of converting the isodose lines to contours after the plan has run through its initial optimization to sort of cool the plan off is a common trick. This is one of our favorites. Number 2 is the idea of using gradient margins. We almost find them essential. I don't know that we have an IMRT or VMAT plan where we don't use gradient margins anymore. And what I mean by that is this idea of 5 to 10% on average rule of thumb, where let's say, for instance, you're trying to achieve dose coverage around a target of 50 gray, but there's a nearby structure where the physician wants a 10% dose fall off as a max dose to that structure. Well, you're going to need at least 2 to 3 millimeters of separation between those structures to physically be possible. Otherwise, you're going to be sacrificing the target coverage. And so just going through and analyzing areas where you can incorporate these gradient margins, not just for targets, but for rings and for organ at risk. We actually design most of our plans now just using gradient margins and not optimizing to anything other than defined structures that have mathematically designed wiggle room to get the dose to do what we want it to do. And the last one is contours. There's nothing as basic as this, but generally if we get a call to do a peer review, or if someone's struggling with a very complicated case, 90% of the time we find that the problem lies in the contours and not anything to do with the beam arrangement or the plan, whether the PTV is going outside the body or it's overlapping with structures that are causing conflict. And really, just to kind of throw it in there, just this idea of standardizing contours, both with names and colors. It seems like a silly thing to consider, but without the standardization of these things, you see potential for mistakes. And so just kind of a return to basics on number one, but definitely still continues to be the most important thing to achieving best practices with IMRT and VMAT. And just to wrap it up, every year we continue to do the plan challenge in honor of an old colleague of ours that passed away from leukemia several years ago. She was a physicist, a dosimetrist, and a therapist. Definitely one of the inspirations behind us doing this project year after year. And you can visit her website here for more information on her life. And if you would like to donate to her kids' educational fund that they've set up, we definitely want to honor Vicki. And finally, just to thank these four key individuals. Looks familiar to a popular TV show, but this is their work attire here at ROR. This is Sharath, Steve, Adam, and Kyle, who put in a lot of work in addition to everyone else at ROR, but this project would not be possible without their help. If you would like more information on who ROR is, what we do, or future projects, definitely get connected and plugged in. This is more of an invitation than it is a presentation, and we hope that you have found something valuable through this. We will continue to improve and try to improve not only with what we do professionally, but also what we provide online and through our presentations. So feel free to contact us, and we'd love to hear from you. And we have some great programs, training programs. We provide dosimetry services and distribute a great software that was highlighted here in this presentation. If you'd like more information, you can contact us here at this email address on the bottom of the screen. And we thank you again for your time and viewing this presentation from ROR. And we look forward to partnering with you on future projects. Thank you.